Hello everyone, I'm bringing you a video today where we'll be talking about the British 1908 patent entrenching tool or entrenching implement. This is of course the two-part entrenching tool which was used with both the 1908 patent web equipment and latterly the 1937 patent web equipment. We'll be having a look at the tool itself in various different versions in the video in some detail, talking about the different carriers for this as well, and also talking more generally about the history of its introduction and its use. So without further ado, we'll get into the main part of the video now and have a look at this entrenching tool. So before we get into looking at the selection of items we have here, a little bit of history on the 1908 patent entrenching tool. It was, of course, as already mentioned, introduced alongside the 1908 patent equipment, and it was based on a design known as the Sirhind tool, which was used by the Indian Army prior to this. It's basically a straight copy, really, apart from some detailed differences. The initial design was slightly different to this in terms of the head design. I can't show you a Mark I head, I don't have one. This is a Mark II head. The Mark I had a similar sort of depth to the eye in the centre as we have at the top here. That was then removed, but you'd have a bulge down the bottom here, making the section with the eye at the centre a bit thicker. This is the Mark II, relatively early Mark II, Great War era. And we have here a Great War era helve. You can see they slot together like that, and it gives you this pick and mattock. Not any use for digging anything particularly deep, but enough to allow a soldier to dig an immediate defence for themselves, basically. That's the intention of this, is to just give basic digging tool to be used in that immediate sort of defensive situation. Obviously GS shovels and so forth will be brought up, and picks and so forth for digging more serious defensive positions. That was the intention anyway. So, as I say, introduced with the 1908 equipment, based on that preceding design, and then used obviously throughout the Great War, and then actually discontinued in British Army use in 1923. Reintroduced into the British Army in 1941 after the somewhat unsuccessful use of the 1939 patent entrenching tool, which of course is the small shovel based on continental practice. So the components we have here will allow for something of a timeline looking at this, the development of this entrenching tool. As I say, I don't have a Mark I head, unfortunately, but nevertheless, we'll be able to talk through much of the development of this with what we have here. It's also important to note that the Royal Navy didn't actually discontinue the use of this entrenching tool in the interwar years, unlike the British Army, so it would continue to see service with the Royal Navy with equipment held on board ships for landing and boarding operations. So, as already mentioned, we have here a sort of Great War era head and helve, and this is a Mark II. You can see that there, not having this raised section underneath there. As said, this tool was then discontinued in 1923, and in 1941 it was reintroduced for use with the 1937 patent equipment, and a new carrier and so forth introduced for its use. So we have here a Second War era head. This is still a Mark II head, but interestingly, it's a different form along the centre here where the eye runs through. You have an enlarged section at the bottom here, and you don't have an enlarged section at the top. So you can see that the profile there is quite different if we compare them side by side. But I don't believe this is of any different mark designation. Of course, it is a 1937 patent entrenching tool as opposed to 1908. The designation was changed. You can see that the shape is otherwise very similar. We have that strengthened section down the centre there. The pick section has actually been beefed up a little bit, and looking at this, I don't think it's seen much use. It's dated 1941. If I can just pick out the stamp again, if I cast a little bit of shadow on that there, it becomes quite clear. Perks, and then you have the government arrow in 1941, and of course 1941 is the year these were reintroduced for service. And we have a Second War clearly dated helve here as well, dated 1942, as you can see there. Slightly beefed up compared to the Great War example. I'll put them side by side there. You can see still a Mark I helve, but just made of a thicker piece of wood. You can actually see in the end here the marks where it's been in the lathe. See that at this end as well. And obviously you have that metal section at the end here, ferrule. It's actually pinned in place, and you can see the grind marks where the pins have been ground off. It's a little bit clearer to see on this one where the pins run through. You can see that there. If it will come into focus, there we go. Hopefully you can see that under the light there, where that's pinned in place. Another change came in 1944 when the helve was developed to a Mark II standard. And you can hear the end of this is slightly loose, slightly loose on the end. Again, pinned in place, very roughly ground off. You can see the grind marks on the metal there where the pin head's been ground off, and you can see on the other side there. So the way that's attached is exactly the same. You have a date here of 1945 and the manufacturer there as well, as you can see, and the government arrow in the middle. And then we have an attachment point at this end. And as I say, these were introduced in late 1944, officially adopted in mid-1944, and introduced in late 1944. I haven't seen many photographs of these being carried during the war. So for versatility's sake, if you're a reenactor, I'd say stick with a Mark I. But they were introduced during the course of the war, the latter years of the war. You can see this end is also pinned in place, and then that's been very roughly ground off. You can see on both sides there. And this mirrors the muzzle of the number 4 rifle, of course, in having these lugs. And this allows for the attachment, I've put it just slightly out of reach, for a spike bayonet or anything using the lug, initially intended for the spike bayonet. If I can get that round in the right angle, there we go. And you can attach the bayonet onto the end there, and this would then work as a mine probe. That was the idea of this. It's not to make it into a weapon, it's to allow this to be used as a mine probe. Rather than just holding it in the hand, it allows you to obviously extend forward a little bit and probe ahead of you using the bayonet. So just an interesting development of the design. As I say, a late war development of the design, and something you don't see a great deal. You don't see all that often during the course of the war, but you do see it post-war, of course, and these were used post-war right through the 1950s. So the next thing to look at here are the carriers for this entrenching tool used with both the 1908 and the 1937 pattern equipment. We have the 1908 pattern carrier, the system for carrying the entrenching tool here. It's not a single carrier, of course. Now in the trials version of this, there was a slightly different method of doing things, sort of more skeletal carrier for the head. And if you want to have a look at that, there's some interesting illustrations over on Khaki Web, which is a website I often recommend people go and have a look at. It really is well worth a look, and I'm going to put a link to that in a comment down below, a pinned comment, should you wish to go and have a look at that. The 1908 section on there, and then look at the equipment carriers section and entrenching tools, and in there you'll see details of the trials version of this. But this is basically how the entrenching tool was to be carried on the set of equipment as introduced. And you have here a separate carrier for the helve and for the head. And we'll look at the head carrier first of all. As you can see, this is sort of kidney shaped carrier. It's designed to fit on the brace ends with these buckles here. At some point it's been blancoed this very garish green colour, which I've toned down with another coat of blanco, as you can see here. Fits on the brace ends with these buckles here. Of course, the braces being 2-inch braces for the 1908 pattern equipment, you have 2-inch buckles there. And then for this example, you have a snap or press stud there, and the head of the entrenching tool just fits neatly in there. As you can see, very nicely sized for it, nice easy fit. This particular example is dated 1916 and made by Miko, as you can see there. So quite a nice example. These would be modified slightly in having a buckle fitted in place of the press stud to secure the strap, and that change was itself introduced in mid-1916, so this must be an early 1916 dated carrier prior to the introduction of that change to the design. The carriage of the helve is attached to the bayonet frog. We have a look at the back here. You can see how that's buckled in place there on the back. You have a strap, a tail on the back of the frog, which then passes through this 1-inch buckle on the back of the helve carrier there. You then have 2 straps which loop around both the bayonet scabbard and the helve itself, as you can see there. The top one has a press stud or snap there. We open this up, and that allows for the helve to be easily removed. And it does mean that you're carrying the parts of the equipment which dangle down below the belt together in one place, so you've only got one thing to worry about in that regard. One thing to mention before moving on to look at the 1937 pattern carriers we're going to talk about is there are versions of this, I don't have one, but there are versions of this which use the same method for carrying the helve as we'll see with the 1937 pattern carriers. That is to say, the helve carried across the back of the carrier like that, with loops here and here. These appear to be dated, or appear to all be dated 1941, which corresponds to the reintroduction of this tool into British Army use, which would suggest that they were manufactured either for troops who were still using 1908 pattern equipment and needed to carry the new entrenching tool, or perhaps for the Royal Navy, who of course had not declared this tool obsolete and were still using it at that time and had been using it with their web equipment right the way through the interwar period and obviously during the earlier years of the Second World War. So just to mention, those carriers do exist out there. I'd be interested to find one day to add to the collection. I don't have one as yet, but just wanted to mention that here. And again, that's another thing you'll be able to see on the Khaki Web website. Again, highly recommend you go and have a look at that. So here we have the first of the 1937 pattern entrenching tool carriers we're going to talk about. This is a particularly nice example. It appears to be unissued. It's unblancoed, as you can see. And this simplifies the method of carrying the helve. You just have two loops sewn onto the back of the cover, and the helve just slots across the top there, as you can see. The strap, which obviously was already mentioned, the strap had been modified to use a buckle on the later production versions of 1908 pattern equipment. That's simply been extended so it loops over the top of the helve and buckles in place down here. And in theory, the tension of this is enough to hold the helve in place when you strap that down nice and tight. This is also particularly tight in these loops. Obviously, as initially produced, that wouldn't be a problem. There is a little bit of stretch in these over time and the helve could end up becoming loose, and we'll talk a little bit about how that was remedied post-war in just a moment. But to have a closer look at this, we'll remove the head, have a look at the internal details, unbuckle that there. Opens in the same manner, the head just slides out there. This particular example is dated 1943. We have a nice clear stamp in there, as you can see. And you can see at the back here, we have a name marked W. Bradley. And you can see how this is constructed here with the reinforcing rivets and the two shapes for the buckles there. So very, very simple, basically a copy of the 1908 design with 1-inch buckles and shapes instead of the 2-inch buckles and shapes, and obviously the loops added to allow for the carriage of the helve there across the back, as you can see. So here we have the second of the 1937 pattern covers we're going to talk about. And as we're talking about post-war developments here, I'll mention two things at the start. One is that the cover was not actually patterned as part of the 1937 pattern equipment until 1951. And the Royal Air Force did not introduce the entrenching tool in 1918 when the Royal Air Force was formed, but did introduce it alongside the 1937 pattern equipment during the war when they changed from the 1925 pattern to the 1937 pattern equipment. So we have here a post-war RAF entrenching tool cover, which has been blancoed in a post-war dark RAF blanco colour, as you can see here. So the modification to this design came about in 1945, and that's what we're going to talk about now. I can get this buckle undone. The strap itself is quite tight. If I can get the brass tip out of the end here. Come here. There we go. Unbuckle that there. In addition to that strap, we also have another strap coming in from the side with a press stud or snap on there, which marries to a male section on the loop. And this helps to retain the helve. So it slides in one way. Of course, it can't slide out that way because the end is too thick. So you have a strap here and that just secures it in place, stops it sliding out the other way. Simple addition to the design, which just makes sure that the helve is secure in the cover, as we have here. There are no visible stamps in this, unfortunately, but as you can see, it carries the head in exactly the same way. It's just a modification to the 1937 pattern design. And you can see it, the original RAF blue-grey colour on the back here. The rivets reinforcing this there and there. Basically, it's a carry forward of the 1908 design with the modifications which it had had for use with the 1937 pattern equipment. The 1-inch straps and buckles there. And then this further modification introduced in 1945 to help secure the helve there. And that's the final development of this. Post-war, it's interesting to note you do occasionally see this, the 1937 pattern carrier attached to the 1944 pattern equipment. I've seen that in Korea with troops in marching order and also with troops of 29 Brigade early in the war. You occasionally see the entrenching tool carrier attached to the brace ends of the 1944 pattern equipment. Something of a rarity, but it did happen. And of course, this system would be completely eclipsed by the introduction of the lightweight pick and shovel with the 1958 pattern equipment. which is a major change to the ethos of British entrenching tools, giving you just a smaller, lighter shovel and a smaller and lighter pick, as opposed to a very small designed entrenching tool like this. And obviously those slightly reduced sized tools are a lot more use for actually doing serious digging and serious entrenching compared to something like this. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. Really quite a long-lived piece of kit, the 1908 pattern entrenching tool. Obviously for the British Army at least, that hiatus in the interwar years and then the early years of the Second World War before its reintroduction, but nevertheless quite a long-lived bit of kit and interesting from that point of view, and obviously an essential piece of kit for a lot of reenactors and so forth. So hopefully the video has been useful from that point of view as well if you are a reenactor. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as I always say, a massive thank you goes out to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.